Hi everyone and welcome. We're just waiting for everyone to join us and we've just started recording, so we'll just get started in 1 minute. Great, so we might get started now. Turn off my notifications. So hello everyone and welcome to this session of Australia at Home. I'd like to start today by acknowledging that wherever we're calling in from sovereign Aboriginal land. So today I'm calling in from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As we know, there is no climate justice without justice for First Nations people. And so I want to acknowledge the incredible leadership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander campaigners, organisers and communities who are at the forefront of the climate justice movement, who are working to protect lands from the impacts of climate change and to stand up to fossil fuel extraction. My name is Lucy Manne. I'm the CEO of 350 Australia. We are a grassroots movement of 60,000 individuals and many local groups all across the country. And our mission is to build a grassroots movement to stand up to the fossil fuel industry and support a just transition from coal, oil and gas to a renewable energy future for all. Before we get started, I just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping so we can run this event really smoothly. So this session is being live streamed on Facebook. So please be respectful, be mindful of that. Don't say anything you wouldn't say in any other public forum. These Australia at Home events are designed to be relaxed and inclusive, and there's a few tips so you can get the most out of it. First of all, we really encourage you to keep your video on. It makes us feel a bit more like we're in the room together, even though we're on Zoom. You can also select what's called gallery view, and that will allow you to see everyone's faces. So in the top right-hand corner of your Zoom window, you should be able to click a button to change the view to put it on gallery view. There's also a chat function, so please use it. You can ask questions, you can make comments, and also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat as well. For now, everyone is muted. If we do call on you to ask your question during the Q&A session, one of our tech support people will unmute you so that you can ask your question. We also encourage you to use your full names, what country you're on, and whether you're representing an organisation. So you can see I've got an example with my name of how you can do that. So if you click the 3 dots next to your own video on the screen, you should be able to rename yourself. And lastly, if you've got any technical issues, you can send a private message through to Jane Garcia. So you can find Jane's name in the chat and Jane can help you with any tech support that you need. So now I'd like to move on to introducing today's session, which I'm really excited about. At 350, we're all about thinking about people power and how we need to stand up to the power of vested interests in the fossil fuel lobby. And that's what we're here to discuss today. We're extremely lucky to have two special guest speakers with us, Marian Wilkinson and Scott Ludlam. Marian is an award-winning journalist and she's here to discuss her new book, The Carbon Club, which is a great read, and it reveals the inside story of how a network of influential climate skeptics, politicians and business leaders fought to control Australia's response to the climate crisis over the past 2 decades. And she will be in conversation with Scott Ludlam, former Australian Senator and now a writer and activist. And after we've had this conversation and some Q&A, I'll come back online and we'll be sharing a bit more about what we can do right now in this moment to ensure that we have an economic recovery to this crisis that puts people and the climate first. So now I'm going to hand over to Scott to take it away.
Thanks heaps, Lucy. Speaking of people power, there are more than 500 people on this call. That is fantastic. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm speaking from unceded Yuin country on the south coast. I'm really delighted to to see you, Marian. Thanks so much for joining us for this event. This is a profoundly important book, could not be more timely. Tell us a little bit about the Carbon Club and what's driven you to get something like this published.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you for everyone who's tuning in. I've been following this issue for something like 15 years on and off. I'm sure, Scott, you've probably been following it even longer. But I wanted to know really why the politics of climate change in this country has become and did become so toxic. And what I wanted to look at was how that happened, why it happened, and who was involved in that. And I guess really that's what the book is about. It's about this network that really fought hard to prevent any major initiative on climate policy getting through for something like over 2 decades. And some of the people in the book, I'm sure the listeners here today will know. There's the obvious people like Tony Abbott and Barnaby Joyce who are right up front on this. There's others that are more in the background that played very key roles. There's a business heavyweight and Liberal Party insider called Hugh Morgan, who was profoundly important in helping to really push the think tanks that pushed out climate skepticism, as well as being incredibly influential at the upper echelons of the Liberal Party. There's curious minor players that I interviewed in Washington who nevertheless played very important roles behind the scenes in helping to foster what they called a people's revolt against climate legislation in Australia. Indeed, even orchestrated some of that from Washington. So there's those sort of revelations. But at the end of the day, I think in this country, this is an issue that has broken the careers of not only 3 prime ministers, but many, many other people besides who are in the book, scientists, business people, I'm sure activists as well. But I realise that unless we really understand this history, unless we know this history, which goes, in fact, right up until the present almost, we are going to remain trapped in it. And I think this is profoundly important because we can see from the scientific evidence that our windows of opportunity here are getting narrower and narrower. This country is about to embark on a major new debate about what we do about a so-called gas-led recovery. I think the same issues will be at play. I think we need to know how the politics of this really works in Australia, and I guess that's what I've tried to do.
It's a terrifying read. I'm not finding it bleak, but it is, there's some pretty plain truths there, particularly in how far back this goes. So you've kind of tracked it back to the 1990s. Somebody's thrown into the chat, follow the money. And I wonder whether the general impression is industry just makes a donation and they get an outcome. It seems to be a lot more complicated than that. So what's the architecture? How's it set up?
I think that's exactly right. It is a lot more complicated than that. When I was doing the book, I'm a follow the money journalist. I've done the Panama Papers and things like that. I love follow the money stories. And certainly the money is important and following the money is important. But as you probably know from being in Parliament, in the Senate, that money flows to both sides of politics. Where the major parties are concerned, even though the majority of it usually goes to the Conservative side. But it is more complicated because what they really realised in this debate was they also had to win what I call the hearts and minds. One of the most fascinating interviews I did when I was in Washington for the book was with a leading climate skeptic there that I'm sure a few of your audience know, a guy called Marian Wilkinson. He was head of something called the Cooler Heads Coalition. He'd been very important in skeptic circles in Washington. Indeed, he was on the panel that helped choose Donald Trump's new EPA chief when Trump came in 2016. He goes way, way back in Australian climate politics, meeting and greeting Australians who came to Washington, introducing them to the highest levels of power there. But he said to me something that I thought was really important. He said way back in the 1990s, at around the time of Kyoto, he felt that they had to fight the science. They had to question the science. A lot of big business just wanted to run on the economics of climate change and how we couldn't afford it. We couldn't afford to jeopardize the coal industry and the gas industry. He argued, unless their side really challenged the science, they would lose the moral imperative on this issue. And I think that was also a big part of why the science was so contested and why it became such an ideological issue.
Well, now that reaches all the way into the Prime Minister's office and indeed into the White House. So you'd have to assess that campaign had been very, very successful.
Yeah, and I think there was a great writer called Guy Pearce, more than a decade ago now, who wrote a book called High and Dry. And about the big sort of lobbying industry around climate change. And he coined a phrase called the Quarry Vision that they had, that this group of businessmen had who were very influential, both with the Howard government, but also with many on the Labor side as well. And that Quarry Vision, I think, is absolutely central because, as I said before, it wasn't just the donations, although the donations are important. It is the fact that for people like, whether it was John Howard or for that matter, Angus Taylor, these are people they understand. It's a vision of Australia that they really understand. And I do get that. I have talked to a lot of these people. They see it as profoundly important for the nation's wealth, for the nation's jobs. But that vision is very, very hard for them to drop. And it's absolutely in the DNA of a lot of the people in power. And you can see now with the entrepreneurs like Mike Cannon-Brookes that are trying to shake this up in the Business Council of Australia, that this clash of visions is really something that is going to grow, I think, in Australia.
Yeah. So as Lucy said at the outset, we're not here to be depressed or distressed. We're here to learn and to understand. We are going to talk towards the end of this session on what we can do about it, and I'll ask you about that in a moment. But it feels like for the time being, you've created something of an X-ray of the power structures that allow us to see into them deeply. You've had access to Tony Abbott, it looks like, on multiple occasions, like you've spoken to very senior people. How important do you think it is to break down that caricature of the sort of one-dimensional impression that we have of some of these people from the media?
I think it is very important because unless you break it down, you can't really see where they're coming from. I think we saw a very good example of this in last year's election, a bit of which I write about in the book. There was, I think, a very interesting clash of these cultures played out in the Queensland part of the election. You will remember with the convoy that Bob Brown had going up to Queensland over the Adani issue, the way the senior officials in the campaign of the Liberal National Party in Queensland played that issue was, I think, very important because actually it wasn't designed to oppose Bob Brown so much, even though they made a lot of noise about that. It was utterly designed to wedge the Labor Party. And that was the campaign strategy right from the beginning. I think it was 2 days before the election, the final groundwater approvals on Adani were given. I've no doubt that was really important in making Adani a central election issue in Queensland. And then the way Clive Palmer could dovetail in on that in his advertising campaign, supporting jobs in Queensland. So that's the sort of politics, I think, that you do have to understand. It's multi-dimensional, and with a lot of these people, how they look at it is multi-dimensional as well. And I think it gets to this issue that is often talked about in the debate over a clean energy economy is, how do you do a just transition? How do you say to workers, not only workers, but communities in regional Australia, there is a future. It's a different future, but there really is a future. It's not just lip service.
Right. I think that's a really important point. I'm noticing there's some amazing questions flowing into the chat. Please keep that up, because we are going to give that some proper time before too long. One of the elements that I didn't have a great deal of clarity about, and I suspect that might be more widely shared, is the influence and the ties to US foundations and institutions. Not just that we borrow their messaging, but it goes a lot deeper than that. Can you sketch out some of that for us?
That is really, really important. I kind of knew it in a sense, but then I didn't really know it. I first came across this, I'd finished up a stint as a foreign correspondent in Washington in about 2005. And I began this sort of side research project outside the Sydney Morning Herald, which is where I was working. It was a friend of mine and I were kicking around this idea for a documentary on climate change and climate skepticism. And at that stage, George Bush was firmly ensconced in Washington, and he was systematically, well, not so much he as we now realise, probably more Dick Cheney, but they were systematically going through, purging things like the Environmental Protection Agency, the various scientific agencies, and really shifting policy. And back then, a couple of people in the environment movement and in the community movement in America give me a whole stack of documents that they'd got under Freedom of Information there. And I came back to Australia anyway. Rather ironically, our Australian documentary that had some of the links in this didn't go ahead because the producers said at the time, hey, it's 2006, Kevin Rudd's going to win, power, Bush is fading, climate skepticism is over. We're going to have, we're going to have climate policy in this country, and no one will buy this documentary, so we're dumping the project. Anyway,
that worked out well.
Yeah, that worked out well, as it turned out. But rather than change the connections between Australia and Washington on the importance of exchanging information from climate skeptics and having them come out here and campaign, having them take their messaging from Washington and bring it to Australia, only got absolutely more important to not only the skeptic movement, but basically the Carbon Club messaging. And it was then interesting for me to going back over people's speeches and appearances to see some of the exact same phraseology that was being used to fight the Democrats' emissions trading bill in Washington was just rolled out here in Australia. And I remember interviewing Penny Wong and asking her, she had been Kevin Rudd's climate change minister, asking her about some of this messaging. And she pointed me to a speech that Barnaby Joyce had given in the Senate at a critical time when Rudd's bill came down. And the messaging was exactly the same as it had been in America. It was around this idea of this is just a great big tax on everything. And Penny Wong said her staff had turned to her at that moment when they were watching Barnaby Joyce on the parliamentary monitor. And her staff has said to her, he's just found the line that will kill us. And she said, it absolutely happened that way.
And so it did. That's right. So in two-party system, and I know politics in Australia is a lot more complex than that, but the machine that you describe in the book, it does have a couple of different faces, and it appears to operate differently depending on whether the LNP or the Labor Party are in government. Is it possible to characterise how in what way does the machine operate differently when you've got Conservatives or Labor holding government?
I think broadly it operates in the same way, but I think some things are different with Labor in government. With Labor in government, as we saw with both Rudd, but more particularly, I think, with Julia Gillard's government, because there had been that support from the Greens, the level of the campaign, the toxicity, if you like, of the campaign, I think was far, far more intense under Gillard's government in opposing Gillard's policies and the Greens' policies. It was definitely a much more toxic atmosphere. I haven't quite worked out whether that's because US politics were changing at the time and the rise of the Tea Party politics, really the precursor of the Trump politics, was already getting a foothold there, and that in turn came to Australia, or how much of it was the fact that Labor had aligned itself with the Greens on climate policy, to the extent that I know there was a lot of compromises by both sides on that policy, but nevertheless it was the Greens that assisted in getting that through the Senate. So yes, I think it was definitely much more toxic in the Gillard times, but with the current government, with the Morrison government, and also with the Howard government, I think the appeal to this is the nation's wealth, this is our vision of the nation, is far more important. And also what's more important is the relationship, I think, usually with Republican administrations. So both with the Trump administration and previously with George Bush's administration, there is a sense that we don't want to get too far ahead of the US on climate policy.
Right. In one of the opening parts of the book, actually on the occasion of one of the, like a big meeting of imported US spokespeople, you describe a pretty feisty Greenpeace action where they completely disrupt the first day's proceedings and throw the whole thing into the news. What's your impression of how civil society groups, whether it be Greenpeace or 350 or more recently Extinction Rebellion and others, what kind of impact do you think they've had in the course of these events over the last 15 years or so?
I think they've had a surprisingly big impact, given what the other circumstances are, what the other forces are in this. And one of the things that did surprise me, going back over particularly some of the Greenpeace events, was how much it did actually impact the government. You mentioned that particular conference, which was pretty interesting, that Greenpeace had absolutely figured out at the time that this was where they needed to be, or where they wanted to be. But quite recently, actually, when I was interviewing Clive Palmer for the book, he reminded me of the campaign, which I do talk about in the book. It was a campaign, I guess, around the first idea of a coal versus coral debate in this country about the reef. And it was the campaign that Greenpeace and a number of other organisations kicked off to fight about expansions of coal mines in Australia, and specifically the Battle of the Galilee Basin. This was prior to Adani even being on the scene. And that was a very sort of feisty operation by Greenpeace, and it was widely condemned by both sides of politics, including the leading Labor ministers who were in power at the time. But years later, Clive Palmer said to me when I was interviewing him for the book you know, that Greenpeace operation, I am convinced it was linked to the CIA because it was all about undermining Australia's wealth. And he was just apoplectic still about the Greenpeace operation. And I remember interviewing, at the time I did a program on Abbott Point and its expansion to handle the Galilee Basin coal. I remember from Four Corners interviewing Michael Roche, who was then head of the Queensland Resources Council, who honed right in on that Greenpeace campaign and said, you know, how absolutely gobsmacked they were by that Greenpeace campaign. So I thought that was quite interesting about how these things do sort of play out. And of course, at the end of the day, when the Great Barrier Reef was under threat of being put on the endanger list, one of the things I discovered from a senior Abbott government official was he said one of the reasons that they persuaded Abbott to fight so hard to keep the reef from being put on that list was that they were really worried it would impact the coal ports if the reef was put on the endangered list.
Right. What this says to me is, even if we don't immediately see the impact, it is felt. They know we're out there. They know that people are contesting.
I think that, yes. And I think it is
we've got taking some of those. Blair, it certainly is that. Blair, have we got you? Do you want to just unmute your mic and put a question? And we'll just ask folk to keep questions fairly short because we don't have Marian for very long. Have we got you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Just a quick one, Marian. How are you? And thanks for your book. And hi, Scott. Just a quick one. Given how fast coal, oil, and gas are tanking and assets are being written down, what do they think is next for Australia? When you talk to them, to interview them, how long do they really think fossil fuels are going to be, you know, our economic stalwart for the next 50 years? And if not, then exactly what do they think is going to be our next economic, kind of stable thing to move into, if it's not innovation into low carbon everything, tech systems, green steel, green hydrogen, etc.?
Well, to me, I think, and thanks, Blair, for the question. For me, I think the clear path at the moment is an absolute holding the line on gas. In a funny way, I think Tony Abbott's government was, in a sense, the peak of Australia's defence of the coal industry. And what happened in Paris, I think, when the Paris Agreement was finally signed, there was a feeling within the senior levels of Australian business that while they would keep obviously making as much money out of coal, including coke and coal, as long as they could, that gas was to be, you know, the resource that Australia had to hang its hat on in order to keep, the exports flowing and the big investments happening in the resources industry. I think that's where we're at the moment. I think that if you just look at essentially what's happened, both in the election campaign in 2019, but certainly with the COVID Recovery Commission, is that all eyes are on gas. And interestingly, that they see the use of gas, not only in Australia, but perhaps more importantly, globally, as continuing right up until 2050 and possibly beyond. That, I think, is going to start really clashing with a number of things, not only, of course, perhaps the science, but more importantly, the financial community, the investment community, and I'm thinking here about especially super funds, pension funds, but I think it's also probably going to start clashing with the Europeans who are looking at things like carbon tariffs and possibly even Biden's administration. But I think for the mainstream Australian thinking in the resources section is certainly holding the line on gas and looking at that for its future.
That's great. Thank you. And thanks, Blair. Look, we did name check Greenpeace before, so it seems only fair if, given that John O'Moylan has put a question into the chat. John, are you there? Do you want to just unmute?
Hi, Marianne. Thanks. And Scott, and I haven't managed to get to read your book, but I'm looking forward to it. I wasn't working with Greenpeace during the start of the Save the Reef campaign, but I think it is encouraging to hear that. What I was curious about was the role of the bureaucracy, particularly following Coronation Hill and the industry associations, particularly the Minerals Council's attempts to insert themselves into very formal roles within the public service. And I guess in my interactions with many people, particularly in state public services, it seems fairly clear that we need to unscramble that egg.
Yeah, the state public service is a whole other area, and I do have to confess that is not a lot. I don't have a lot of that in my book. If the one area does sort of come up in more is the Queensland and the Curtis Island gas development, and that's a whole lot more unscrambling. And I know there was a few Four Corners programs done on that were pretty interesting. The bureaucracy is a very important issue here, not just the public servants. I think almost, and probably more important in a sense, is the number of people who go through the revolving door from industry onto political staff, of senior officials, back into lobbyist groups. Back, it's sort of almost like the endless circle now in Australian politics. And Guy Pearce, who I mentioned before, obviously, had his very colourful description of the greenhouse mafia for them. I think one of the tragic things that you do see is that you do see senior federal public servants who are trying to push through policy only to find that the sort of this caravan of lobbyists and influencers who go in and out of staff positions tend to try and sort of run rings around the policy advice. And especially the sort of older public servants that I interviewed who are now retired talked a lot to me about how it wasn't even just that they were disappointed, they were literally sad about the fact that they felt today, and certainly during that latter period from the Gillard government through to now, that the triumphing of vested interests over national interests has become something that has really damaged the bureaucracy and the political advisors. So, yeah, I think that unscrambling that egg, there's a bit of it in the book. There's certainly a lot more of it that needs to be done at the state level, I think.
That's great, and thank you for the question. We don't have Marian for much longer, so I might try and squeeze one more in. George has just thrown a question into the chat that I'm really keen to hear your take on as well. Georgia, do you want to just unmute?
Hi there, Marian. Thanks very much. I'm just wondering how you evaluate the influence of individual companies. I'm thinking of, the BHPs and the Rios and the other big companies. How do you evaluate their influence, including perhaps in behind the scenes activities, in holding Australia back from developing meaningful climate policy in comparison, say, for example, to the role of the Minerals Council and some of the other peak lobby groups that do their climate wrecking more publicly?
Yes, very, very interesting question, because one of the things I found was that the big companies would, especially the publicly listed companies, would come and go depending on whether this piece of legislation or that piece of legislation affected their own interests. But what they would do, of course, is let the industry associations, whether it was the Business Council or the Minerals Council or the Coal Association before that, before it merged with the Minerals Council, they would take the lead in pushing these positions. So I talk about some detailed campaigns where they really went to war with the Gillard government over the emissions trading scheme, but the vehicles used were, of course, industry or lobby group vehicles in the big advertising campaigns in marginal seats, which is, of course, the way these things usually work. But I do think what is interesting is that what we saw in the last days, I think, of Turnbull's government, Malcolm Turnbull's government, and the beginning of the Morrison government was a shift where certain sections of what had been the Carbon Club were splintering amongst themselves, because some of the big companies, obviously, like BHP, have to be attuned to not only their shareholders, their the superannuation and pension funds, but more importantly, they are getting more and more worried about legal cases. There's been a number of legal cases, as you know, in the US, the ExxonMobil cases, there's quite a few of those, but others besides. The companies, the big publicly listed companies, are really, really exercised about this. So you see a sort of splintering, and about 18 months ago, you saw a big split on the Minerals Council about this. But my feeling is that whatever their differences, if it's a key piece of legislation that goes against the broad industry interests, people will come together for that. But there's definitely divisions there, and I think there's definitely divisions between some of the gas and some of the really hardline coal interests. And we saw that with the battles that Glencore, the big Swiss mining giant, tried to do during Turnbull's era to hang on to the thermal coal industry here and hang on to the expansion of that. That really, really didn't sit well with some of the other fossil fuel companies who were trying to, of course, push the line that gas was the transitional fuel. So there's splits, but I would say they definitely come together when a piece of legislation goes against their joint interests.
That's amazing. Just before you go, and maybe as a throw to the final part of our conversation, I'm interested to know, having looked pretty deep into a pretty dark place, do you remain optimistic? Are we stuffed? How do you come out of this book feeling in terms of what you think people should do?
Well, by nature, I'm an optimist, Scott, and so yes, I am optimistic. I think there's a great line in Ross Garnaut's new book, Superpower, which looks to Australia's energy transition. And he says something like, we have left the next generation with an awful problem, but not an impossible problem. And I think that exactly. I think that in a way sums it up. And one of the things that I am actually quite frankly amazed by, when you look at the effort to kill off so many pieces of climate legislation over the years in this country, the way that things like the renewable energy industry just ended up sort of punching through, partly because of the amazing technological development, partly because public support in Australia for renewable energy was so deep, not only in the cities, but critically in the regions. And because of what the state governments, various state governments did, as well as the federal renewable energy target, it actually forced a change on Australia that a lot of people resisted and thought would never happen. So, and I guess now I've been trying to read up a lot on things like the hydrogen policies, whether in this country we go for green hydrogen, that is powered with renewable energy, or whether we're going to go down the what's called the brown or the blue hydrogen route. I noticed the other day the German government making a big pitch to try and shift their heavy industry towards a future hydrogen era. So I think having watched my own industry, the media industry, being forced to transform, often in a way we didn't like, but it transformed under our feet whether we liked it or not. I think change is really possible. And I think that one of the things the development of the renewable industry in Australia has taught us, that it's a hell of a lot faster than most people in power thought it would happen.
Well, it's hard to come out of a conversation like this feeling optimistic and with a bit of hope, but somehow you have done it. Thank you so much for joining us. I wish we could kind of, the thing I really miss in Zoom calls is applause. You are owed serious applause. There's nearly 570 people on the call. Yeah, we can see applause in the little video windows. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey, it's really appreciated.
Thank you, Lucy, Scott, everyone behind the scenes, and thank you so much all the people who took the time and the effort to join this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, well, there's years worth of research in this, and it shows. It's just the effort is appreciated. All right. Well, that's our segue really to from the stage of understanding the industry and the dimensions of what it is that we're up against to taking action. I've been keeping one eye on the chat on the way through. This is a pretty action-oriented audience, I suspect. There's not a lot of spectators on here. It looks like it's a pretty feisty group of people, so I don't think we're going to have any difficulty persuading folk that there's plenty we can do. The phenomenon that Marian speaks of, I first came across in South Africa, and they call it state capture. It's the thing that's kind of lies in the space between petty corruption, which there's plenty of in this country, on the one hand, and full-blown corporate oligarchy on the other. The space in the middle, which I think Marian has very adeptly described, is what they call state capture, where we still have degrees of freedom. It's still a conversation that we can have in relative safety, many of us, but clearly industry has got very, very deep penetration of the public sector, the political class, the media, which a few folk have name-checked in the chat, particularly the Murdoch media. So there is plenty going on around the country organising a response. Some of it is a bit below the surface. It's not always very evident, but there's heaps happening, whether it be the civil society groups organising anti-corruption legislation, national ICAC, and the kind of anti-state capture laws that would be required to offset this kind of thing. But also a lot of groups just taking the fight up directly to industry, bypassing the political class and just going straight after industry, either at a shareholder level, a board level, occupation of foyers, as we saw earlier in the week. There's heaps going on. Lucy, do you want to run us through a little bit of what 350 is up to?
Great, and thank you, Scott. So yeah, I just want to talk a little bit now about, I guess, the current political landscape and what's happening right now in terms of how the themes that Marian has been researching are playing out right now, and really importantly, what we can all do about it. So there's going to be some really practical ideas for campaigns to get involved in with 350 and with other organisations as well. So just to kind of situate this conversation in where we're at right now, which has already been alluded to, as we know, at the height of the first wave of the pandemic and in response to the worsening economic crisis, our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, really quietly announced the establishment of this new body called the National COVID Coordination Commission. It didn't actually attract that much attention at the time, but very quickly what emerged, thanks to investigations by many organisations, was that this was a handpicked group of business people, and it was absolutely stacked with representatives with direct financial interests and board director roles in the gas industry. And what we've seen since then, so that was in March, since then there's been this really concerted campaign by the COVID Commission to use the pandemic basically as cover to secure large gas bailouts. So large taxpayer money to invest in new gas fields, build gas infrastructure. And even more concerningly, the Morrison government has now announced its intention to pursue this plan and is calling it, in inverted commas, a gas-fired recovery. Now, we know that if they're successful in creating these large new subsidies for gas, it'll be an absolute disaster for the climate, for traditional owners who have been fighting for years to protect their land from these projects, and for the environment. And to put it in context in terms of climate, there was a great report just out from the Australia Institute and the Australian Conservation Foundation, which shows that just our existing pipeline of gas projects with prospective gas resources, if developed, could emit up to 3 times the annual world emissions. So we absolutely must stop this in its tracks. And of course, also this public spending would direct money away from where it's desperately needed right now. So we desperately need now economic recovery measures that are going to prioritise high quality jobs for the future, climate action, and social justice for those who are being most impacted by this crisis. And so this push for gas subsidies is incredibly alarming, but at 350, we absolutely believe that it can be stopped. And Marian alluded to this actually, but I think the reason we know we can stop it is actually the fact that we're talking about a gas-fired recovery, not a coal-fired recovery. So grassroots power over many years, I think, has really succeeded in shifting the politics around coal extraction in this country. And this has been even in the face of the tactics of the Carbon Club. So if we think back just 3 years ago, Scott Morrison was literally waving a lump of coal around to Parliament. It was given to him by the Minerals Council, which was a founding member of the Carbon Club. But now in 2020, 3 years later, even the government's own technology roadmap that it released this year makes it pretty clear that coal isn't going to play a big role in our future domestic energy mix. When you look across social movements, we've prevented the government from giving public money to Adani. So we've prevented the giving of public money to large fossil fuel projects before. There are so many Australian and international banks that won't finance new coal mines anymore. There are many coal port proposals on the Great Barrier Reef that have been dropped. New coal mine approvals have been rejected in court. And we've also seen incredibly staunch resistance from traditional owners to protect their land, including the Wangan and Jagalingou people who are fighting to protect their country from the Adani mine. And all this progress has really only been possible due to sustained grassroots campaigning. It's behind every single one of those victories that I've just mentioned. And it's not just kept fossil fuels in the ground, it's also just shifted the politics of climate and coal in Australia. And there's such a long way to go, but the question's changed. So the question isn't anymore, will we transition away from coal? The question is, can we do it fast enough? And extremely importantly, can we do it in a way that prioritises workers and communities who will be impacted by that transition instead of protecting corporate profits? So it has been done, and absolutely we can do it again, but we are in the face of this huge new moment really where gas is in line for public subsidies. And really what we need is to develop the same kind of mass public outrage that was developed around coal, and we need to do that for gas. And if we can do that, we really can stop the Morrison government in its tracks. If we can do that, it also will create the political conditions, I think, to put people above profit and to create the environment we need to have an economic recovery that actually puts people first and will actually address the really unprecedented social and economic crisis we're seeing that is really deepening injustice and inequality around Australia. So there's some really, really practical things that everyone on this call can do to support this work. So I'm just going to name a few of them and then really keen to hear everyone else's suggestions of other actions that can be taken. So I think the first thing everyone can do is support Aboriginal organisations that are working with traditional owners who are on the front line of proposed gas extraction projects. So I can see Kelly is in the chat putting some links in. So 2 great organisations that I'll name. First is called Original Power. The second is called the Seed Youth Indigenous Climate Network. Really, really important to support the incredible work by these organisations standing with traditional owners. The second thing you can do, so 350 has launched a national campaign to stop these gas bailouts. So you can sign up to that campaign by signing our petition. That petition is growing really fast and we'll be delivering it. But as importantly, if you sign up, it means that you'll be on our list and we're going to keep you informed about all the developments and how you can keep taking action as the campaign develops. And then the third action I wanted to give you the opportunity to take is to get involved in the Fund Our Future Not Gas September 25th Day of Action. So this is being led by school strikers. It's another global school strike day of action, and here in Australia it's all about stopping this money for gas, and the school strikers are calling on adults to hold solidarity actions. So you can sign up on the school strike website to get involved, and also on 350 side we're going to be supporting with lots of actions on the 25th, and then we're also going to be supporting people to keep pressuring the MP, keep doing actions all the way in the lead up to the federal budget, which will be announced in October, which we think will be a really key moment. So we've got a sign up page. So if you want to get even more involved and take ongoing action in your community, really encourage you to put your details in there. And so I think there's, we're up against so much, but there's so many things that we can do. And I think we've seen that it's worked before and we can do it again. So I actually really genuinely do feel optimistic. And I think that the Carbon Club is absolutely on the back foot, and the climate justice movement has really never been more powerful than it is right now. So I might leave it there, and then I'd really love to take any further questions. We've just got a few minutes left, but I think particularly if people have other actions or campaigns that they want to share, it would be great to start calling on people.
There's a lot of really good stuff going into the chat. Thanks heaps, Lucy. That was an awesome traverse of a huge amount of stuff that's going on. While you were speaking, a lot of people have been pasting links for actions, for meetings, for Angus Taylor's electorate office phone number, for groups that exist. There's a ton of stuff going into the chat. If you want to save that out, you can do that just by hitting the little ... next to where you type in your messages. That gives you the option to save the chat, which I think we will do as well and can circulate if that's handy. That means you've got access to all of those links later. We do have a couple of minutes left. If you know of actions, if you're involved in stuff, if there are groups that you think need a bit of a bump or actions coming up that you want people to know about, paste it in right now. And yes, for folk on iPads or watching this on your phone, we will organise to get a copy out to you somehow. But I think that's the main thing that I want us to take away. It's really, Marian's book is very, very legible. It's easy to read. It's not using a ton of scientific language. It's kind of devastating on the soul. But if we don't know how these people operate, there is no way that we can contest them. So I reckon we have time for one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Somebody has asked, what is happening about the Narrabri gas project? That is a behemoth and it didn't really cop a mention. Does anybody want to take that one on?
I'm
Lucy?
happy to take that one on. So it's a great question. Yep. Narrabri is a huge proposed gas project. There's a lot of pressure for it to be approved, but there's been a historic groundswell of public opposition to it. It's in New South Wales. There was a record number of submissions put in from the community opposing it. And if you want to be involved in that campaign, I would recommend looking up Lock the Gate and signing up to Lock the Gates through their website, signing up to get updates on that campaign from them.
Awesome. Somebody has asked you to mention the dirt file. That sounds interesting. What is the dirt file?
Great. So all this work we did looking at the COVID Commission was this project called Fossil Fuel Watch. So we've been tracking all the demands from the fossil fuel industry, and these subsidies for gas are just one small part. They're also trying to rip up environmental laws, get new coal mines approved, undermine workers' rights. And so if you go to fossilfuel.watch, you will be able to look through everything that we've been tracking, all the research, and also take action through there as well.
All right, did you catch that? That was fossilfuel.watch. That is amazing work. A bunch of stuff there on the COVID Commission and all of the creepy crawlies that Marian details in the book. The website is really legible and easy to get your head around. Oh, yep, okay, and that's just been pasted in there. So we're going to grab a copy of the chat, thanks to everybody who contributed, and numbers have started dropping. So maybe we wrap it there. We had, I think we were on our way to about 600 people. I cannot thank you enough for taking an hour out of a busy day to be with us, to share your optimism, your expertise, your background and your thoughts. Lucy, do you want to take us out?
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Scott. It's so amazing to see in the chat just how much action is going on in the face of this. And yeah, just want to say thank you as well to Australia at Home. You can sign up to come to future events like this. They're fantastic. I've been to quite a few of them myself at australiaathome.com.au. So yeah, thank you everyone, and see you next time.
All right. See you before long. Thanks all.